Okay guys, we're going to be talking about the Cold War today, after my brief hiatus from doing these lectures with you guys. So thanks to Mr. Burgoon, he knows way more about Russia than I do. But I hope that this can be beneficial to you guys, and the objective that you're wanting to get out of this is to know basically the basics of the Cold War, okay? So who's involved, what are the big vocabulary words that we need to define, how was this war fought or not fought as it turns out. So we're going to be looking at all of those issues today. The first thing that we want to do is define what the Cold War actually is. First thing that we need to know is that it lasts from 1945 through the early 1990s. And I want you to note beside the year 1945 that this is the end of World War II. So out to the side of 1945, just jot the note end of World War II. And then where it says through the early 1990s, I want you to jot the words collapse of USSR. So those are our two bookend events. World War II will end. The alliance that had been holding the United States and the USSR together fell apart after Hitler and the Japanese Imperial Army were defeated, and they began a period of tensions that will last until the early 1990s. 1991 is the year that the USSR was fully dissolved. So World War II turned the US and USSR both into superpowers, and this just means that they led and influenced international affairs. This was a big deal because it was a change from what had been previously. In the years before World War II, Great Britain for sure, France, and also Germany were the real world powers. The United States was an industrial power, but we chose a foreign policy of isolationism between really World War I and World War II, well, 1941 really. And because of that path of isolationism, we really didn't take an international role in any really important way. So World War II totally changes that. Britain and France and Germany are all completely exhausted by World War II, and they're going to end up losing almost all of their colonies in the few decades that follow World War II. So what that leaves is sort of a power vacuum. The United States steps into it, and we take a really active role in world affairs that we had not before, and we have a sort of diametrically opposed enemy in the USSR, which held different economic and political beliefs from ourselves. And that's the next bullet point. We had really different worldviews. We were democracy, we were capitalist, and the USSR follows a totalitarian model and a communist-style economy. So the goal, again, and we've already gone over this in class, but the goal of communism is to create that completely equal society, and not equality of opportunity, but actual equality of circumstances. So that's very different than what the U.S. would like. The U.S. wanted to allow sort of autonomous action of individuals and success or failure based on, one's effort. Obviously, there are flaws in that system, but I think that most people would agree that there are more flaws in the system that the USSR was using. And we'll talk about what those were. Mostly flaws in terms of treatment of people, citizens, and the disregarding of human rights that the USSR had throughout the Cold War period for citizens of their own nations. All right, so what is the Cold War? So that's when it was, that's who were involved, what is the thing in and of itself. It's an era of really high tension between these two ideologically opposed sides. Our side is called NATO. NATO still exists, actually. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not North American, because that would make it sound like it was like us, Canada, and Mexico. That's not who it was. It was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Us, Canada, Britain, France, democracies across Western Europe that kind of bordered the Atlantic Ocean, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that's who our buddies were. Universally, they were democracies, and universally, they believed in capitalist economics, even if those capitalist economies were moderated by some sort of socialist elements. Okay, the USSR, it had its own set of buddies. They were called the Warsaw Pact. Some of these nations wanted to go communist. Some of them did not necessarily want to, but didn't really have a choice. Their neighbor, Russia, to the east, was more powerful than they were, and in many ways, Russia sort of forces those governments to become communists. And I want to backtrack a little bit and tell you how that happened. You guys remember that the British and French and American and Canadian forces landed at Normandy Beach in 1944, and then they began to push eastward toward Germany. The goal was eventually to take Berlin, the capital. The Soviets were doing the exact same thing, except moving west from the Far East, through Eastern Europe and through Poland to reach Germany and to reach Berlin. The USSR actually, during World War II, reached Berlin first. Even though the USSR was not supposed to occupy those Eastern European nations, it already had troops stationed in them because they were moving through that territory of Eastern Europe to get to the capital of Berlin. When World War II ended, the Soviet Union really did not leave or exit its military presence. They kept it there, and we're going to talk about why here and then also in class. Here's a look at NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact is in red. NATO is in shades of blue. We had various members join over the years. So Warsaw Pact in red. You can see it's Eastern and Central Europe and the Soviet Union, which at the time was way bigger than the modern Russia is today. All this stuff here is independent nations today. Over here is the Crimean Peninsula, which is in the news all over the place right now, right? So Ukraine is over here. It was actually a part of the Soviet Union at this time and a part of the Warsaw Pact. All right, how was the Cold War fought? Mostly through arms race, okay? And not just any kind of arms race, nuclear weapons. We'll talk about this also in class, but just as a sort of brief overview, much of the policies of how we would build up our arms in the Cold War were dictated by a theory called MAD, which is Mutually Assured Destruction. MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. Put a little star beside this. Anything in bold is a vocabulary word that needs to be learned by you. Feel free to make a note card if you need to. This really just means that there was a buildup of nuclear weapons on both sides, and if either side decided to pull the trigger and use those nuclear weapons, you all know how nukes work, right? Pretty much the idea is nobody's going to really, quote, win this war. We're both going to be assured of full destruction. We will mutually be assured of destruction if either of us goes to war. So it was a really funny conflict because, not funny haha, but strange, funny strange, because there wasn't any direct confrontation between the two superpowers in terms of war, because if either power had gone to war or used the nuclear option, both powers would have literally obliterated one another from the planet. It was also an ideological conflict. We were in an intense competition to spread our beliefs of capitalism and democracy to new nations and formerly colonized areas that were now becoming independent of colonial control. Vietnam is a wonderful example of that ideological conflict spilling over into military conflict. We didn't directly confront the Soviet Union in Vietnam, but we both fought via proxies. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Proxy wars are where we basically support opposing sides all across what is called, quote, the third world. And if anyone uses that term third world today, we usually don't use that term. It's kind of passe, and it doesn't really mean, the way people use it is incorrect, basically. In the concept of the Cold War, the first world were democracies, the second world was the Soviet Union and its allies, and the third world were non-aligned countries. So when people talk about the third world, usually what they mean are developing countries or nations that are still on their way toward good governance and industrialized economies. And so in this sense, I'm using the word third world in its real sense. Non-aligned powers that we were kind of competing over to have them join our set of buddies, either the democracies under capitalism or the communists using socialist models of economics. All right. Oh, and you guys probably know a bunch of examples of proxy wars, right? I mentioned Vietnam, but Korea is an example. We'll also be looking at Afghanistan during this lecture. Okay. You've also probably heard the term the Iron Curtain. Draw a little llama beside this vocabulary word. You've got to know it. The Iron Curtain is a concept. The Iron Curtain is not a real curtain of iron. Please, please do not believe that there is a curtain of iron stretching across Europe, okay? I think that students get confused on this concept because there is a physical wall in the city, or there was a physical wall in the city of Berlin, and so they sort of think, okay, there must have been some sort of like wall separating communist Europe from non-communist Europe, from democratic Europe. But there is no curtain of iron. It is a figurative speech. It is a figure of speech, okay, a metaphor. The USSR wanted a buffer to protect it against further German invasion. I hope you guys remember, I just spoke about how the Soviet Union rolled through Central and Eastern Europe on its way to Berlin and then did not exit its troops out. The United States and Britain wanted free elections. So, the Soviet Union at the close of World War II was already in control of Central and Eastern Europe. Instead of exiting, and instead of having free elections to decide whether or not they wanted communism and socialism or whether they wanted democracy and capitalism, Stalin, the premier of the Soviet Union, the leader of the Soviet Union, instead just didn't leave Eastern Europe or Central Europe. He made sure that there were communist, friendly to the Soviet Union governments in place in all of those areas that we just saw in red on this map. Okay, so Poland, Czechoslovakia, which it was at the time, Romania, other areas like that. Okay. In a very famous speech, which we will look at an excerpt of, Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II, we saw him in the other lecture, he had the bowler hat and the cigar in his mouth all the time. He called the division of the communist eastern part of Europe and the democratic western part of Europe the Iron Curtain. So the division between those areas metaphorically was known as the Iron Curtain. In fact, it was a militarized border. Okay, so there were elements of, physical barriers there. There was barbed wire, there were military troops garrisoned along the border between NATO and the Warsaw Pact countries, but there was not a physical curtain of iron, sorry. Here's an adorable little kitty for you, East German kitty. Now, there was a real wall, as I said, in dividing Berlin into two sides. And as you can see, this poor little East German kitty is behind the Iron Curtain. Okay, sorry, interlude of a kitty. Germany after the war. Let's talk about what happens to what had been Hitler's Germany. Germany, from the perspective of most Europeans, had caused two horribly destructive major wars, killing literally tens of millions of people in the matter of half of a century. So they did not want a strong Germany. Germany was, therefore, split into two pieces. The thought was, if they split Germany into two pieces, they would be smaller and therefore less strong. One was the East German Socialist Republic, and one becomes West Germany, which was a democracy. The city of Berlin, which was itself in East Germany, was divided into 4 sections, and each one of those was run by one of the great powers. And if you would, right beside where it says City of Berlin divided into 4 sections, will you please note that City of Berlin is inside of East Germany. So there's this tiny island, the area is run by Britain, USA, and France. Within Berlin, there's a tiny island within Berlin of democracy. in the midst of the East German communist state that was aligned with the Warsaw Pact and the USSR. It was a really interesting setup, and one that was bound to cause a lot of tension. The Berlin Wall, however, does not go up until the 1960s. I think a lot of people assume that the Berlin Wall, like World War II ends and snap, the Berlin Wall is up. No, it took about 20 years for that to actually occur. Germany was totally devastated, by the way. It looked a lot like this picture of Japan. Japan, this is the other defeated power. Japan was occupied by the USA from 1945 until 1942. We actually wrote the Japanese Constitution. The only request of the surrendering Japanese was that they be allowed to keep the position of emperor. So Hirohito, the emperor, during World War II was kept, but he had no power. He was a ceremonial figure, a lot like the Queen of England is today. And there is still a royal family in Japan, an emperor and his wife, and they have 2 kids. But even still today, they don't hold power. They have ceremonial and symbolic roles. Democracy was installed in Japan, and this is really the beginning of a huge turnaround in Japanese history. I mean, Japan, you can see it right there. Its resources were utterly, totally, and completely exhausted. But just as in the Meiji Restoration, Japan sort of like did a 90-degree turn and, 180-degree turn, and began improving and trying to like take on a new way of life. In the same way, after World War II, Japan does the exact same thing. And by the 1980s, Japan is a huge economic power. And of course today, we associate Japanese products with like quality and awesomeness, right? Like Toyota is a quality product. And so Japan has sort of built a democracy today on the back of that economic progress that they began investing in right after World War II. The other thing that is created is called the United Nations. Unlike the League of Nations that was created out of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, the United Nations has a lot more muscle. There's an actual military force that all of the member nations contribute to, although their main goal is to like mediate and stop warfare. They are still like actual physical boots on the ground troops. Okay? And they monitor human rights and social problems, and they work to protect groups of civilians during times of crisis throughout the globe. It served as a forum, an open forum, a peaceful forum in which very powerful nations could air grievances, discuss issues, and resolve problems in a non-violent way. That's the goal of the United Nations. Basically be non-violent. Make sure that big, huge, horrible wars like World War II that killed 60 million or more people don't occur again. They, of course, have secondary goals like improving the life of children, which is the goal of UNICEF, things like that. However, the real main goal is to be a forum where global powers can come together to debate their disagreements peacefully. It started with 51 countries. Today has about 190, maybe a few more. All right, the United Nations is set up in a pretty simple way. One is called the General Assembly. This is where every single nation has a seat at the table and a voice at the table. However, the United Nations is not the same as a democracy. Okay, the main superpowers who came together to create the United Nations after World War II obviously were not going to just hand away all of their global authority and power to a party that could somehow strip them of that power. Instead, what they did is, in addition to the General Assembly where everyone has a voice, they created a Security Council. There are 5 permanent members: the United States, the USSR, Great Britain, France, and China. There are also 10 rotating members, so there's usually like a member from Latin America, a member from Africa, a member from the Middle East. Okay, and those 5 permanent seats on the Security Council have veto power. So anything that a single one of those nations does not like, it's possible for them to veto that action by the United Nations, and then that action will not be done. There's a really, really strong amount of authority and power invested in the Security Council. So I'd like you to note out to the side of Security Council that these permanent members have veto power. These permanent members have veto power. Here's the General Assembly room. I think it looks kind of 70s. It still looks like that today. Like that olive green, you know. Alright, now that is not the end of your show. We're actually going to look at one more, Cold War Part 2. However, it's not any longer than that, so we'll kind of fly through this pretty quickly. Alright, just like I said before, the Cold War is a period of tension and rivalry between these two sides, the USA and NATO versus USSR and its Warsaw Pact. Now, we had a number of different foreign policy ideas that dictated how we behaved toward the Soviet Union, and when I say we, I mean the United States, how we behaved toward the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The first is containment, and the second is domino theory. Think of containment kind of like a Tupperware container, right? As long as you keep the lid on it, that gross smell of, I don't know, ancient meatloaf cannot escape. Okay, that was the idea. We wanted to stop communism in its tracks. It had already spread. It was already in the USSR. It was already in all these other places. We wanted to make sure that it didn't go anywhere else because we believed in domino theory. The idea that if one nation goes communist, then others would follow. China, North Korea, North Vietnam, Cuba, all of those do have communist revolutions throughout the period of the Cold War. Now, domino theory doesn't really hold true. Strayer did a great job in the last chapter that you read of explaining how communist nations were not like one unified, monumental, undifferentiated side. Okay, they had internal disputes. In fact, China and the USSR nearly went to war with one another in the 1960s. Okay, so but our idea was that if one goes, everyone else will follow. So we had to contain that spread, and we were very afraid of that spread. All of that tension, of course, leads to mad theory, which we just talked about, proxy wars, which we also defined, and the space race, which is really just a cover for weapons development. Okay, you know, rockets that like take astronauts up to the moon. Really, those are rockets that can propel nuclear ballistic missiles across continents, which are called intercontinental ballistic missiles. So NASA, still today, I mean, it's a super cool organization, but its original goal was, although, you know, we were interested in discovery and in getting a man to the moon, a lot of that interest and the money for those programs stemmed from our desire to stay one step ahead of our enemy, the USSR, in weapons technology. The IAEA attempted to regulate nuclear material and weapons, although there is proliferation, aka spread of nuclear weaponry to a number of nations. I think today there are 11 different nuclear nations, like us, Great Britain, France, Israel, obviously Russia, North Korea, and my brain has stopped now. So there are a number, Pakistan, India, both. Anyway, the goal, though, is to stop other nations from getting nuclear weapons because they're so scary. Out to the side, where you've got space race, out to the side of space race, will you please write the abbreviation ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile? That is an important thing. All right, let's talk about some areas where there was tension. First is at the moment that Israel is created. This was in 1948. It was established by the UN, but the UN's decision was really, in this instance, mostly dictated by the desires of the United States. The Holocaust really pushed this issue to the forefront. There were people called Zionists, which are people who want a Jewish homeland. It's part of that nationalist movement that we've been talking about for the last few chapters. There were nationalists among the Jewish population called Zionists before World War II, but after the Holocaust, that idea really gained traction, and people felt like the Jewish population deserved a state that they could, from which they could defend themselves from other powers. Now here's the problem though. Palestinians who lived where the state of Israel was plunked down really did not have a say in that matter. They didn't have a seat because they were not a nation at the United Nations when this decision was made, and other Arab nations actually voted no. So basically they got their land taken from them, and of course we've had a lot of wars since then. If there's time at the end of the year, we'll take a 1 or 2 day look at just this Israel-Palestine issue, which I hope we'll have time for. We also had a flashpoint at a place called Berlin, which we've already talked about, in an event called the Berlin Crisis. This was in the 1950s. The USSR, remember, Berlin was inside East Germany, right? The USSR decided that they were just going to take over all of Berlin, which is already in East Germany, rather than have it divided up into these little sectors. So the United States and British planes actually made sure that our side of Berlin would not be cut off from supplies. So we actually just did a huge airlift, and it went on for like a year. Eventually the Soviets backed down from blockading access to Berlin. They had cut off all road transport into and out of Berlin. So of course, we just used the planes, but eventually they backed down, but it was like a really big deal. So the problem is for East Germany that East Germany was kind of economically not as awesome as West Germany. So a lot of people wanted to flee to West Germany, and they could get there by crossing over into West Berlin, and from there crossing into West Germany. And there was a huge flight. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people left East Germany via going to West Berlin. So eventually, by 1961, the East German government puts up the Berlin Wall, which will eventually be like armed and have patrols and all kinds of stuff to prevent East Germans and East Berliners from crossing to the west via that route. There's the wall right there. You can see they had to raise different, take down different apartment blocks, because people, when the wall first went up, some people go up into the apartment buildings because the wall just zigzags through the city, and they would actually jump from, if the apartments were close enough, jump from one window to the other to go into West Berlin. So it was really kind of crazy time point. This is checkpoint Charlie. This is sort of the American Allied checkpoint between, and it says you are leaving the American sector. So this is the Soviet sector over here, and over here is the American sector. So in fact, it was a really truly divided city. All right. There were also flashpoints in terms of true warfare. The United States and the USSR fought one another via proxies in Korea. And you guys know what a proxy is. I've seen people use proxy servers all the time to get around firewalls and stuff. It's the same sort of thing. You're using one source to get into another source, basically. So a proxy is just someone through whom you're fighting in this sense. We call it the Korean conflict, not the Korean War, because we never really declared war. The South, which was a democracy, was invaded by the North, which was communist. Now, this is an interesting tidbit, but the North today, you all know that North Korea is literally the most crazy, weird country on the planet. Its citizens believe that the South actually invaded the North, but in fact, the North came down and invaded the South to attempt to unify the two Koreas and make both of them communist. The United States helped South Korea fend off that attack, and the USSR and China helped the North as they tried to push down south. The North was unsuccessful pushing further south, but technically the two Koreas are still at war with one another, and this area is the most, this big yellow line here is called the demilitarized zone, but it's actually the most heavily militarized border anywhere on the planet right there. And we'll look at Korea a little bit later when we look at a concept called Asian tigers. We'll compare South Korea to North Korea. And you guys will see this area is like an economic powerhouse, and North Korea can hardly feed its people. But elites keep that, they keep propping that system up. Some of you guys, if you went to Kuna, probably, of course, know about North and South Korea, since I think that was the country you guys were. There was also a proxy war in Vietnam the following decade, throughout the 60s and 70s. This is just the same. The communist North moved down into the South, and they wanted to create one unified Vietnam that was all communist. We supported the South. Communist powers supported the North. Interestingly, this war for a lot of Vietnamese is viewed as a war of like anti-colonial liberation. But in the United States, we viewed it through the lens of containment, communism, and the Cold War. So it did not go well for us. We actually, the United States withdrew in 1973, and the North moved into the South, taking it over, I think, the following year. The last one is a Soviet war called the Afghan War. It began in 1979 and lasts throughout the 1980s. I found a good quote from this guy. He's a former Soviet commander. He said, "We wanted to bring peace and stability to Afghanistan, but in fact everything got worse." That's totally true. Afghanistan actually had a mini communist revolution in the 60s, I think. And it was threatened, it was going to be overthrown, so Soviet troops actually invaded Afghanistan to prop up that communist regime. And the U.S. actually supports the opposing side, which in this case happened to be Muslim guerrilla fighters, the dudes like those on the left. Ironically, this is sort of the foundation of who the United States is fighting today. Although at the time they were called the Mujahideen, a lot of elements of that sort of arming and training of those forces kind of morphed into elements of the Taliban, who are still sort of up in the mountains fighting guerrilla wars today against our own troops. The Soviet Union's resources throughout this decade-long war were totally drained. And this is, I want you to put a star by this, where it says Soviet resources were drained. I want you to put a little arrow, and I want you to note on your paper that this is one of the main reasons that the Cold War ended. This war right here. The Afghan War, the USSR expended a huge number of resources to fight in Afghanistan, and there was not a lot left for improving the quality of life of people back in the Soviet Union, and it is one of the prime reasons that the USSR collapsed eventually and the Cold War ended. All right, there are a number of attempted uprisings against the USSR. We're going to backtrack in history a little bit. The most important is the Prague Spring. There was a revolt in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia, which was known as the Prague Spring in 1968. Both of these attempts to democratize and throw off what was viewed as the imperial Russian control of those governments they were crushed, and neither of those revolts worked. We did not interfere because we were, of course, worried about getting into a nuclear conflict with the USSR, and of course Mad Theory says, we are mutually assured of destruction, so that fear actually prevents us from going to war with the Soviet Union. Of course, eventually the Soviet Union will fall. As we all know, there is not a Soviet Union today, just the Russian Federation, which seems eerily similar. Gorbachev, he comes to power in the Soviet Union as premier in the early 1980s, maybe late 1970s. Sorry, I don't have that date in my brain. He wants to change the Soviet Union's structure because their economy is just being really crappy. They can keep up in terms of military, but they cannot keep up in terms of consumer goods and all that kind of stuff. So people, the average everyday Soviet citizen, were kind of disgruntled because they didn't have a very good quality of life. He wanted to improve that. He also wanted to focus on weapons production. So this is a problem because they didn't really have the economic resources to do both. They couldn't have an arms race, fight Afghanistan, and have consumer products. So they were in a kind of catch-22 between a rock and a hard place. Gorbachev develops two policies. One is called glasnost, which is openness in politics, and one is called perestroika, which is restructuring of the economy. You must know those two terms. I realize they are not bolded, but I want you to like double star, put a llama beside them, draw some underlines. Perestroika, and I realize they're funny sounding, okay? Perestroika, changing the economy and allowing more free enterprise. Glasnost, allowing people to actually critique the government so that change can actually occur and improvements can actually be made because people aren't afraid to speak up and note when things are crappy. This does allow for dissent, but the problem is that it lets the cat out of the bag. Okay, once Gorbachev allows some free enterprise and some free speech, it's like you know, when you give a mouse a cookie, he'll want a glass of milk. Okay, so it was that kind of problem. People got a little bit of taste of glasnost and perestroika, and they wanted more. Pretty soon, the USSR was in a state of total collapse, and it did not have the economic strength or political will to stop it from happening. And that's Gorbachev right there. He's kind of distinctive. He has that birthmark on his head, so you can pick him out of a crowd, I guess. Lastly, in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. As Russian authority fades, aka as the centralized government loses power, all those nations in the communist bloc or the Warsaw Pact nations decide to assert their own destiny. Okay, they had a surge of nationalism. They were tired of being controlled by the Russians. There were huge public demonstrations throughout East Germany and throughout Eastern Europe in general. One night, pretty much, East Germans just tear down the Berlin Wall, and communist governments fall all over Europe and the world throughout 1989, 90, and then finally the USSR itself in 1991. That's the basics. That's the stuff that you have to know. Please know those vocabulary words. That's big deal kind of stuff. Okay. Well, I'm trying to shut this down, but I can't. Where is it? Well, for pity's sake. Stop being crazy.